Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to another episode of Archon's Adversaries. Today we will be discussing how to combat the Tau Empire, the Tau roster, and being in the way of Tau expansions. Now, starting right off with army operations. The targets of the Tau, these are vulnerable, oppressed, and above all, nearby worlds. Now, the Tau Empire, their imperial ambitions, are really based on things that are close to their sphere of influence. This is generally about a sector's worth of space, kind of close to the central northeast of the galaxy-ish. They have several sept worlds there, which are kind of their home worlds that they spread out from, and they have expanded in several generational shifts over time, and they view both Imperial and random Xenos and other species worlds as worthy to be included within their collective. Going to be enlightened into the greater good is how they say it, but in reality it is Imperial expansion. They seek land, they seek opportunities for expansion, and of course they come into conflict for these reasons. Now, I say vulnerable and oppressed because that is how they see a lot of Imperial society, and that is how a lot of Imperial society gets shown to the citizens that they try to corrupt, or otherwise influence. So their targets are planets that are relatively easy for them to get to with their warp travel. They cannot travel directly through the warp. They kind of dip in and out of an upper level of the warp. So think of it as little teleportation spurts where they dive in with a bunch of ships all together, literally hooked together, and then they bob back out again, and they essentially almost hopscotch through the warp, or tunnel through the warp, where they come up to real space pretty consistently, take another check essentially of where they are in the galaxy, and then they go back in again and pop up in another location. This is relatively slow compared with average space travel for the Imperium or most other factions, but it is also a lot less dangerous, and while it can leave them in areas where they don't want to be or make it hard for them to maneuver effectively, it also means that they're not as vulnerable to warp-related shenanigans, mostly also related to the fact that they have very weak souls. Something that we will talk about in another video about the Tau, or later on when we get to Farsight. So, objectives: cultural, social subversion, and subsumption. So, cultural, social subversion is a thing that has become kind of a meme about the community, but it is actually one of the go-to ideas for the Tau. They know, or they assume, that most Imperial worlds are very vulnerable to the idea of oppression or a better life. Essentially, they offer their way of life as superior to the Imperium's. And they view it that way for a lot of different reasons. They don't really understand the collectivism of humankind. Since they are a multiracial empire, granted the Tau are on top of their hierarchy, but still, they are a multiracial empire. They don't really get the idea of xenos species being inherently aggressive towards them, because most of the species that they have run into have been relatively friendly, or at least willing to accept their diplomacy. Things like the Kroot, the Vespids, and all the other minor xenos species that they have run into, again, in a very small amount of space, somehow. I believe that the Tau originally were in an area that was very hard for Imperials to get to, or was at least way out of the way of anyone's travel plans, basically. And then, as a result of that, a lot of xenos species that would have been killed during the Great Crusade ended up being available for their diplomacy eventually. So, cultural social conversion is the first step for their objectives. They want to bring people into the Empire with the goal of the greater good. And the greater good is essentially collective progress, collective increase in technology, peace, homogeneity of the Empire, and, cultural strength. If you have a patchwork community of different interconnected societies, the Tau view that as superior as long as it is under the rule of the ethereal class. And then finally, subsumption. What does subsumption mean? It essentially means that while the Tau might initially accept your society or take you in as brothers and equals, they do eventually find a place for you in the hierarchy, based usually on how complicated your society is and how intelligent you are. So, for example, there are certain species like Kroot and like Vespids who are a lot can be more animalistic or can be more sapient, and the Tau will put them above or under other species based upon that. The other part is subsumption is related to how they deal with uprisings and with any threat to the greater good, which we'll talk about with stages here. So, the stages of the Tau invasion. Let's say that your planet X is nearby to the Tau Sept worlds, and you've thus far managed to stay away from any Tau engagement into your territory. There hasn't been any fights just yet, but you know that there's some conflict going on because anywhere near to the Tau is vulnerable to their invasion, theoretically. The first thing that's going to happen is attempts at diplomacy. And now you think, this is 40k, diplomacy never works. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it legit does with the Tau. And there's a couple of reasons why. One, the Ethereals have some weird mental powers, whether it's just really good charisma or straight up they have some sort of psychic ability, is not clear. At least on the Tau, they seem to have some sort of brainwashing talent. And whether that can extend to other species over time is unclear. But even just with traditional diplomacy, the Tau do attempt to be diplomatic, at least initially with a species that they meet. Not saying that's going to happen with all Imperial worlds. The Tau are aware of how violent humanity is and how much we hate aliens. For very good reason. People often point at the Imperium's xenophobia and say that it's a bad thing. No, humanity was the prey of alien species that would make the Tau Empire look like a tiny, tiny little dot on the Imperial map. Like, the Tau have the liberty of calling themselves saviors in a universe where humanity exterminated all of the Grell, all of the enslavers, a whole bunch of mentally psychic domineering alien species, the Nerthine, just a whole bunch of massive xenos post Old Night empires or dominions that had held humanity in their grip for centuries, if not millennia. That xenophobia is hard-coded into humanity at this point. So the Tau know that, but they still do try diplomacy at some level. They will at least try to get some of the lower classes or some of the regular common people to submit or surrender or work with them. The other thing that they do is they take prisoners, unlike a lot of other Xenos factions. The Tau will take prisoners, and they will also try and conform human beings to their way of life, to the greater good. They will try to enlighten them. So the attempted diplomacy is the first one. Whether it's done, via dagger diplomacy, they try and start an uprising on a human world. Not as common, but it can happen, even unintentionally. Or they try to offer some agreement to the humans living there. Naturally, most good Imperials would resist that outright, but there are some planetary governors who are greedy, self-confident, ambitious, whatever it may be, who think that their world would do better under Sept control than under Imperial control. So, that's the first step. The next one is a naval blockade. Now, the Tau Navy is numerous and technological, but it is not very heavy. Now, what do I mean by not very heavy? They have lots of escort-type vessels, and then they have some capital class, but their capital class vessels are nowhere close to the equal of capital class Imperial vessels, and even their cruisers are only equivalent to Imperial light cruisers. While they are heavily armed, their size and armor protection is more equivalent to a light cruiser than they are to a true Imperial cruiser like a Luna class. So, in comparison to a Imperial naval blockade, which will include at least one cruiser-class ship, probably another light cruiser, and several escorts, A Tau fleet that goes in for a naval blockade is probably only going to include 1 or 2 cruisers and then 5 to 7 escorts. And that would be considered a large naval force. That does not include the merchant marine forces that stay with the Tau and some of the auxiliary ships. So the Tau have kind of a two-sided navy. They have an offensive navy, which is more weighted toward escorts with a very common reliance on these smaller cruisers. And with occasional capital ships, but it's mostly small, lighter cruisers and a lot of escorts. And then they have their merchant marine or their merchant class vessels, which include escort-sized freighter ships, some larger freighter ships, and then allied auxiliary ships, which can be up to capital in size, but are generally a little bit worse armed than Imperial capital ships. Now, their naval blockade is not as strong as an Imperial one, but it is still a naval blockade. They're absolutely capable of isolating a world because they have lots of escort-class ships, and they can pretty effectively get rid of things like system ships, naval monitors, orbital weapons platforms. They can probably deal with that, so they are capable of a blockade. The next step would be initial landing. Now, for the Tau, something that I've noticed as I've researched them is a lot of their tactics for getting onto a planet are very close to those of the Imperial Guard. They use mass landing transport ships and flying escort craft and air and void breathing vessels to essentially bring troops down from air to ground in a direct classic insertion method, which means that they're not doing Space Marine things and flying their troops directly from orbit into a combat zone, on average, and they're also not doing any necessarily super complicated landing a ship down and then beginning a massive move. They don't really do that. They do the more traditional Imperial Guard thing of troops go into ships, ships go into space, ships go from space into oxygen, then they touch off on the ground, troops deploy, set up a camp, traditional army things, which I like. And then they will begin a traditional invasion. The Tau have a very specific way that they like to do their invasions, and we'll talk about that when it comes to the actual combat ways, the ways that they like to fight. But it is a traditional invasion. They don't have any of this, consumption thing like the Tyranids did, or any, specific goals other than conquest like the Space Marines do. Space Marines are just to cut off the head of a force and then leave. The Tau are around for the long fight, and they have a pretty trad way of doing war, with the additions of their various troops and their special technology. And then the final steps of invasion, once that's completed, is subsumption and extermination. Now, this is an important part of the Tau that people like to not talk about, but the Tau do accept other species into the collective. They want to raise people to the greater good. Humans are not always acceptable into that vision. And one of the common things that you'll see is that certain sect worlds see humans as inherently more dangerous than any of their other allied xenos auxiliaries, and where some of them may try to subsume the culture and incorporate the human, spirit into their forces, either, as slave labor or as troopers or even as just regular civilians. They'll try and return to normalcy once they win. The dark side of this is that since humanity is so inherently resistant to that kind of alien oversight, to that conquest, there have been many examples of forced sterilization, genocide, or mass extermination on human worlds, where the humans are continually rising up, continually endangering the Tau, constantly resisting in the way that Imperial citizens have been taught to, and in the way that humanity often does. The unconquerable human spirit the Tau are experiencing, and the result is mass genocide and ethnic cleansing. Essentially, they will slaughter, sterilize, or starve the human population to death and take the world over for themselves. Now, this is more common with some septs than it is with others, but it is a part of the Tau strategy that is often inherent in their governing style, so to speak. So, if they can't beat you into submission, if you won't accept the greater good, they have absolutely no qualms about killing you all. So, just something to remember. Force size. So, The forces are generally broken down. At the largest side is the Sept and the fleets. So Tau fleets, like I said, are relatively large, but they're relatively light. The ones that we're talking about will be a smaller fleet, more of a patrol than a true battle fleet. But the fleet is the largest mobile one, and the fleet represents a Sept force. So the Sept forces are from different worlds. They're sometimes led by different ethereals. They have kind of branches or deviations within the Empire. I'm not sure if they're supposed to represent political differences or they are just like army groups are for humanity. But in either way, they are different inherently, and they have somewhat different cultures and battle tactics. Not always, but at the heart of it, they all subscribe to the same ideology of the greater good. Army auxiliaries would be the next smallest one. So you have armies, and then you have auxiliaries, and then finally you get to organized military units. So those are the smallest ones, where you have squads of infantry with support units and all that stuff. So, branches involved. On the ground side, we'll be talking a lot about the fire caste. There are different castes for the Tau. Fire is the kind of warrior caste. Ground are the builders and engineers. Air caste are the folks who are piloting a lot of the ships and stuff like that. Void ships. Land, sea, and void. Mostly this is going to be fire caste, and then void will also be air caste. The ethereals are the overall leaders of the Tau. They have that kind of psychic or indoctrination deal where Tau warriors will not refuse orders from an ethereal, with one wonderful exception, which we'll go over later. I'm going to get in trouble with the Tau people when I talk about Farsight. And look, you're going to get mad at me, and it's okay. We can disagree. I just personally like Farsight for one specific reason, and it kind of has to do with the ethereal that he beheaded. So, yeah. All of the branches are involved. A really big one for the Tau is their air force. Now, a lot of Tau vehicles can fly or kind of jump pack around. There are units that are very heavy that have a great deal of mobility because they have jump packs or jump jets. Crisis suits, some of the larger battle suits, all of them have a lot of mobility, and they kind of count as combo air and ground units. But even without that, there's a lot of anti-gravity units in the Tau forces, and a ton of drones, which we will go over. But all of that I consider kind of an air or an air-ground unit. So very important to them is their air force. Commonalities and variants. So like I said, Sept worlds have some differences between them, both in their colors, their way of war. Most of them subscribe to the same type of combat, they just do it in different ways. Some of them are stealthier about the Mont-Ka, some of them are more direct about the Mont-Ka. Other ones do Releth-Ka or Releth-Ta, which is stealthy infiltration or like asymmetrical warfare combat, things of that nature. I have not memorized all of the different Tau battle doctrines, because they all boil down to essentially Blitzkrieg, but Tau version. So the subspecies of Tau and auxiliaries are the other variant thing that occurs here. So a lot of alien species show up within Tau society or Tau armies, and they are already subsumed, already believers in the greater good, and they follow the Tau as leaders, as spiritual leaders, kind of this Maoist thought cult of, well, of course we have to follow, of course we have to obey. We are a species of the Empire, this one goal, one good, one nation, one people mentality that holds the Tau Empire together. The auxiliaries subscribe to that very heavily, and they have very different capabilities in comparison to the Tau. The Tau specialize in one type of warfare, a lot of their auxiliaries specialize in a different type, and in some cases they fill in gaps that the Tau have. So, moving on to how to resist the Tau force. Sorry, just going over some of the pictures here. I will go into each of these units as we go through. So, base level defense. I have developed a system that I call the Umbrella and the Scorpion, or the Scorpion holding an umbrella. So this defensive structure essentially requires that you do two things. You need to neutralize the asymmetrical assets that the Tau have. Usually this implies bringing a lot of anti-air or artillery onto the battlefield, and being able to use it pretty effectively to slow the Tau down. And then you need to launch counteroffensives against the Tau. You can't allow them to regain momentum at any time. Essentially, the entire defense of your world is based upon keeping the Tau on the back foot and never letting them roll any momentum up and keep a consistent offensive going. Even if, like, this is the thing, even if the offensive is suicidal and there's no point and you're just wasting folks, it is worth it, because once you stymie the Tau, once you stop their offensive or even slow it down, they will have to readjust, and that readjustment period buys you a great deal of time, because unlike other forces, they are very particular about their planning periods and about the amount of time that they need to set up for offensives. Now, they are mobile, but they are very particular when it comes to planning. And so having this umbrella defense, having the ability to neutralize assets, if they bring in aircraft, you want anti-air. If they bring in heavy assets, you need to have artillery. If essentially, you need to have this umbrella defense, this preparatory asset barrage to throw at them, and then you need to not let them come to you and catch you on the defensive. You need to go on the offensive against them as quickly as possible, even if it's a waste of resources, because that will delay the amount of time before they can start their momentum up again. And once the Tau get momentum, once they really start breaking through, once that Mont'ka, that aggressive blitzkrieg tactic, has actually started to affect you and started to damage your defenses, it's very hard to stop. It's very hard to get ahead of these forces if you don't manage to keep that umbrella intact and defend it. You need to do it with offensive action. Violence and speed of action are important when you're fighting the Tau. Who to call and how. So, I haven't talked about the Imperial layered response all that much up to this point, but it is a very important thing with the Tau, because the Tau don't have any way of shutting the Imperials up, and they have absolutely no way of forcing them to give up quickly unless they manage to culturally subvert you. Now, Imperial layered response forces are essentially a universal tactic within the Imperium. When one planet calls for help, other planets send out that call further, and there is an echo effect. So, one planet says, the Tau are attacking us. The planet next door says, the Tau are attacking this sector. And then that goes out to another planet. And then, all of a sudden, every planet in the sector is shouting out, there are Tau attacking the sector. What does that do? It draws in whatever is nearby towards the defense in wave upon wave upon wave. For example, one shout from one planet that is directly under attack will draw a couple of regiments from the nearby sector, or might get a couple of planets nearby to send out a distress call and send some orbital defenses. A couple of escorts, maybe a cruiser, some little thing that was released from the local battle fleet or something like that. But the more alarms that are tripped, and the longer that the alarm goes off, because of course, the astropath doesn't just shout once, he continues to scream until he's shut up, which means that until the Tau take the planet will continue to scream, it will continue to call for reinforcements, and it will continue to give updates on the situation to the rest of the Imperium. If that continues for a couple of months, a couple of years, then the local sector will begin organizing a much larger response force. At first, it might have been a couple of regiments and a couple of escorts to bother the Tau logistical lines. A couple of raiders or something like that from the Navy, just to be annoying, and some regiments that got there in time and landed on the planet under orbital cover. The Tau can deal with that. They don't really have too much of an issue with that. Then, now that they're in combat, they're continuing to get in a fight, and this Psyker is continually screaming into the warp. Well, the next thing that comes might be an Imperial patrol. Sure, that's going to be a naval fight. They have a cruiser, maybe a 5 or 6 escorts. More like 3 or 4 escorts. Maybe they have a light cruiser or 2, and that's what they bring in, and maybe it'll be an orbital war. Yeah, the Tau can still deal with that. They can still fight with the Imperials on relatively even footing, even with the 2 light cruisers and 7 escorts that we're working with. A battle with an Imperial patrol might not be an impossible fight for them. But then if it continues, you will get more regiments, you will get battle fleets, you will get capital ships called in. As the conflict goes on, essentially, the more trouble that you cause, the more alarms that you cause, and the longer that you allow those alarms to call out, the more layers of the response force will get mobilized and will get underway to come and kill you. Now, even the first layer of this isn't instantaneous. I'm counting that there's going to be regiments on this planet because it's near to the Tau, and the regiments would be stationed there to prevent the Tau from taking it over. But the Imperial Layered Response Force is inherently designed like a spider web, as in the more alarms that you trip and the longer that they are tripped, the larger the force that comes to reclaim that world is going to be, and it can get to sizes that the Tau literally cannot deal with. The few times that an actual force has showed up that was Crusade size to fight with the Tau, they were crushed utterly. And they've realized that they cannot stand up to that size of a force, and so they try and do their best to get around or to outspeed the Imperial Layered Response so that they can try and take the planet in a timely manner. We want to keep them from doing that in Adversaries. So, dangers and restrictions. Important thing for this one, neither of these forces can orbitally outstrip the other. So, the Tau are strong enough in the orbital war that they can land their troops on the planet. They can't get stopped outright. And they can destroy anything like orbital stations or space elevators, any random system ship that might be around that tries to resist them. The Tau fleet can deal with it. But at the same time, they can't just sit above the hives here and orbitally bombard them into no longer being a threat. They have orbital weapons that are dangerous enough to threaten any of the Tau ships if they stay above the hive for too long. And then finally, infiltrations into your society. This is like Chaos Cults. You need to find the individuals who might be vulnerable to Tau propaganda. And believe me, the Tau are very good at propaganda. They are great at lying and covering up the atrocities that they've done. And they can be very convincing, especially to the lower classes of Imperial society who feel ill-used, who feel, that they've been cast out by the Emperor, or that don't have a very strong religious or loyalty to the Imperium. The Tau will try and pick away at your society and take those people and use them to their own advantage. They will use them to infiltrate your society, they will use them to weaken defenses, they will use them to weaken the resolve of your soldiers to fight. You need to find and purge those seditious portions of your society, with the utmost violence, preferably. Again, the Tau are not going to be put off by it, but it will prevent you from getting subsumed as easily. You don't want to cause riots on your planet, but you definitely don't want a bunch of workers to start choosing the Tau forces over your own or helping out the Tau. That's something that you cannot accept as an Imperial Governor. You need to put that down immediately. And ensure that it stays put down. Any Tau agents who are in your society, any who try to sneak in or anything like that, you need to be walking around consistently with a lot of forces. Planetary defense forces are encouraged, but enforcers and police where you don't have them, find the aliens, execute them, execute anyone who was working with them, kill them all. Do not let them get out. And do not let them ruin the don't let them infiltrate your society. So, assumptions of adversaries. It's assumed the forces are relatively equal. So this is going to be a relatively large ground engagement for the Tau, with a full patrol of vessels, as listed below. The Tau invasion force is going to be 2 of their light cruisers. Again, the Tau call them cruisers. They are a quarter the size of an Imperial battleship, which makes them more on the weight side of a light cruiser equivalent. Then 7 escorts, plus the merchant and auxiliary fleet. So, that is the naval forces that they have. Assuming that they've already killed all of the orbital, all the naval forces of Planet X. We'll go into that in a second. But the infantry side of things, we have 10 cadres of fire warriors that are about 30,000 fire warriors each, not including things like drones, etc. So, cadres are like Imperial Guard companies. I've put them as a lot larger than companies just because it seems to be implied that they're either full regimental size or they're small regimental size, so I put them at about 30,000 men. If they are actually company size, this would be a lot smaller, and you'd be looking at something more around the size of 30 to 300 cadres. But either way, let's say around 300,000 fire warriors, which is a pretty significant force for the Tau. That is a large ground army. Then on the auxiliary side, we have a mix of Kroot, human, and Vespid auxiliaries. Vespid are little flyy bastards like the drones from Halo. Humans are the worst scum in the universe. They are traitors to the Imperium of Man and deserve nothing but death. And then the Kroot. who are Chewbacca equivalents. They're big, they're strong, they're tough, they get kind of flesh melded or gene bred into being fighters, and let's say there's about 50,000 of them, which is a pretty average number for the Auxiliaries. There will usually be more fire warriors than there are Auxiliaries, but the Auxiliaries will be deployed in force so that they can make use of their own particular ways of war. And then in addition to that, let's do an additional 300 war suits or vehicles. So, roughly 300 is a pretty large force, but you can't assume that all of these are going to be war suits. A vast majority of them are probably going to be transport vehicles, aircraft, things of that nature, but let's assume, because we're doing the entire roster here, that there's at least one of every type of warsuit or vehicle available to the Tau, which, again, considering they're a very traditional army, it's not unreasonable to say that some of the Kardras will bring multiple different types of units with them. They don't have the same restrictions or limitations as the Guard, and thus they employ a lot of combined arms. Usually it's mechanized or kind of drone-related, but either way, 300 of those, whatever they may be. Finally, let's get to the other side. The Imperial world has orbital defenses. It has one broadside macro cannon. To give you a reference as to what broadside versus flex means, broadside is slightly less, well, not accurate, but slightly less flexible in how it can shoot. Broadside macro cannons, for example, would be embedded in different areas around a hive and have probably a 10 to 15 to 20 degree angle. So they're basically designed just to counter things that come within a 30 to 50 degree angle of the hive at an orbital range. These are giant cannons, and they would essentially be in either a large bank or they would be spread out around a planet, and they would be pointed at the sky, and the broadside ones are mostly designed to fire only at orbital targets, or about at targets in low orbit as well. The other thing would be flex. So flex lances, they are lance cannons, which are energy weapons, and they are designed to have a lot more mobility. Essentially, they can angle down to almost 90 degrees with the ground, or at least they can angle at a near 180 to the hive in general. So whether they can fire down at targets on the ground is questionable. Some of them can be modified to do so, but not all of them are required to do so. The flex lances essentially give you more mobility and more coverage, covering at least 180 degrees from the hive. We will talk about orbital defenses when we talk about Exterminatus, because it is very important for that. And orbital bombardment in general. But the back and forth for that is essentially that flex lances and flex weapons in general can hit more targets, they have a wider angle of fire, while broadside weapons tend to be much more large and in charge. They have a ton more firepower, but they have much more limited angles at which they can hit targets. So, moving on. 500,000 PDF troopers. For a planet that has 1 or 3 billion people, 500,000 PDF troopers is not unreasonable. Matter of fact, it is pretty low. But I assume that there's 500,000 because there are also 3 regiments of line infantry with 150,000 men total, which puts them at about 50,000 infantry troopers per regiment, which is pretty average for a line infantry regiment, if a little bit on the low side, theoretically. Well, it's actually exactly average because they can have anywhere between 25 and 100,000. So, just a tiny bit below median. So, the 500,000 PDF troopers are going to be equipped with essentially semi-automatic or bolt-action solid slug weapons, and probably bayonets or something of that nature. No real body armor, pretty basic communications, standard PDF stuff. Then the regiments of line infantry, let's say that for this system, or for adversaries, they're going to be equipped with mostly emplaced or set up support weapons. So we're talking about Hydra flak batteries, Earthshaker cannons, things of that nature, and then some basic support weapons like heavy bolters and autocannons. pretty average for a line infantry regiment. They will usually have one mobile defensive item, like a heavy bolter, autocannon, heavy stubbers, things like that. And then they will have one support option, like small amounts of artillery or anti-aircraft. That is pretty average. You could also theoretically give them something like anti-aircraft missiles or something like that, but yeah, it's not guaranteed. And then the other things, the structures that we're trying to protect here, are two conjoined neighboring hives. So let's say that they are both, not spire. Let's say that they are both column hives, and they are nearby to one another. And they are relatively connected. Essentially, the skirt of the column or the city around the column hive is connected to one another. So they're not too far apart, and between each other, they both have one flex lance each, and between them, they have one broadside macro cannon. A pretty average hive setup. And considering that this planet only has 2 hives, that means the population is probably going to be anywhere between 4 and like 6 billion-ish. And then on top of the hives are various industrial cities or mines. So this would be areas that are producing steel, they're bringing stuff out of the earth, and they're going to be spread out around the hive, and rail networks and transit networks and nodes will be used to ship those things back to the industrial cities, centers, or to the hives for off-world transit. So, the baseline troops for the Tau. Let's get into the actual adversaries part of this. The Strikers, or the Fire Warrior Strike units, or the Fire Warrior Breacher units. These are the tactical assault infantry. And now, I mentioned that the Mont Ka is essentially a Tau blitzkrieg. It is this idea of a constant rolling offensive that not only keeps an opponent on a constant back foot, it prevents them from using any of their weapons or tactics to their best effectiveness, because they're essentially taken unawares by a large, broad front assault that is, punctuated with very strong, overwhelming firepower. And the baseline of this rolling wave is the tactical assault infantry that is Fire Warriors. Now, for all that Tau are usually not as physically impressive as humans, and especially not so with Guardsmen, the Fire Warriors are a little bit stronger than the average Tau. They are genetically bred to be bigger, bulkier, stronger. They're a little bit heavier, and while they still use ranged weapons as opposed to melee weapons, they're not complete pushovers, essentially, like a majority of Tau are. I'm not going to say that every Tau is terrible at melee combat, but it is a pretty consistent thing that between their morphology, their biology, and their combat style, they prefer, outside of the Fire Warriors, to use their weapons and kind of shun melee combat. And even the Fire Warriors, it's kind of an in-between thing where they can, but they're really not made for it. So, I have labeled them tactical assault infantry. Why? They have a bunch of units and a bunch of specialized weapons and tactics that make them not so much an outright assault infantry. They're not designed to do things like shatter bunker complexes or attack heavily fortified areas. They're tactical. They're designed for infiltration fire. So they will, they'll be able to break through things like trench lines. They'll be able to overcome entrenched units that are on the edges of enemy formations. But they're not designed for heavy direct combat any more so than an Imperial assault infantryman is. So while they can attack they can attack trench lines, they could probably do smaller concrete bunkers or things like that, but attacking a hive wall, attacking bunker complexes that are very large or interconnected, not something that you'd want to use Fire Warriors for. They are vulnerable to medium infantry support weapons like heavy stubbers, and while their armor looks very impressive, it is made out of a similar armaplas to what Imperial Navy armsmen are equipped with, so it is on par with the medium protection of the Imperium. So I would call it the equivalent to full flak. In some cases it's superior, in some cases it's inferior, but in general it is about equivalent to full flak armor, even if it tends to be made out of metal instead of ceramite over flak weave. So, weapon analysis. Pulse weapons, I have to talk about these in detail because it might be a while before I come back to the Tau and I need to explain what these do and how they seem to work logically. Again, I'm not perfect with this. The Tau are a very complicated faction. I spent a good time doing research for this, but I'm going to be honest, some of these did not make a lot of sense to me when I was reading them. So, pulse weapons are microplasma. So, what do I mean by microplasma? This is a pulse carbine. These are the ones with a built-in flashbang launcher. It is literally just like a light grenade. But what they are is that they are relatively short range. Again, it's weird. The carbines are relatively short range. The rifles are just a little bit better range than the average plasma rifle for the Imperium. They're said that they're more reliable or robust. I don't think this is necessarily true. I think it's the fact that the plasma weapons of the Tau are firing such small amounts of plasma, more equivalent to something like a blaster from Star Wars, kind of an ionized air thing, and we'll talk about that with the ion weapons again. It's like, is it an ionized air laser? It's something similar to that, but the pulse weapons seem to definitely be plasma weapons of different grades and sizes. Obviously, there are larger pulse weapons. The rifles seem to have just a little bit more range and accuracy than the standard Imperial comparison. So, where a plasma rifle in the Imperium can probably fire accurately out to 100 meters, maybe a little bit further, the Tau pulse rifles seem to fire about maybe 30% further than that, maybe a little bit further, up to 150, maybe even pushing out to 200 meters with a little bit less accuracy. But it's microplasma. It's firing a very small pocket of superheated gas. This penetrates a lot of armor, and as a standard infantry weapon, it's actually very good. With the downsides of being a little bit slower firing, and of course not having the same damage, impact, or armor penetration as a standard Imperial plasma weapon. So, downsides and upsides, it's more reliable, it has slightly better range. The plasma carbine, or the pulse carbine, is shorter range than the plasma rifle, but it is longer range than the plasma pistol, so you could argue that it would have an effective range somewhere around 75 meters, maybe a little bit less than that, and maybe 60 meters might be a little bit more reasonable. But they also come with the addition of a flashbang launcher. And this is another reference to the Breachers being a assault infantry unit. You know, they're not engaging with enemies that are so covered and well built in that they can just ignore things like flashbangs. They're going to be running at things like trench lines, and they're going to be overcoming them with superior firepower and with shock. Which is one of the reasons why they have the inbuilt flashbang launcher, because essentially they need to stun the enemy in a situation where they are, you know, theoretically outgunned by enemies that have more fire rate than they do, or might be more numerous than they are. So, that's the pulse weapons. Ion weapons. These ones are a little bit confusing in how they work, and I'll talk about them in depth. So, the implication with these is that they are equivalent to like a Star Wars blaster, and they hit just a little bit lower, or just a little bit higher than the average las gun. That seems to be the implication. Now, you can overcharge them to be the equivalent of something like a Hellgun, or I call it the Hellgun side grade, where, okay, it's equivalent or a little bit better, but it has a chance of damaging the weapon when you do that. But the average shot with the ion weapon is an ionized beam. So, it doesn't say what is getting ionized or what is becoming charged particles, but it's assumed that it's something that can go through the air. So, I put it as an ionized air laser, or like a packet of ionized particle, whatever it may be, that essentially melts or transfers its energy into the target. And to me, that smacks of being almost exactly the same as a las gun, except instead of using photons, light, it uses ions, which are a little bit heavier, a little bit more destructive, and, you know, just a little bit more massless, as they are actual atoms instead of photons, instead of light. So, these are, again, it's questionable. They seem to be a little bit more accurate, have a little bit more range, but it's also not clear how they interact with things like air, how their accuracy is. One thing that is often noted with Tau weapons is that they have a gyro stabilizer in the gun. Now, I'm just going to say outright, gyro stabilizing a weapon at the tip of its firing makes absolutely no sense. If you know how firearms work, putting something that moves the barrel around when it fires, or that keeps the barrel from moving, it either implies that the weapon has a free-floated barrel, which makes no sense because they're all energy weapons, or that there's something in the gun that is moving that needs to be stabilized. What I think this is, and what I think makes a lot more sense, is that the gyro stabilization, or just the stabilization in general, has nothing to do with the weapon itself, and has to do with a muzzle reference device that is a targeter for the Tau. Now, you notice a lot of Tau have built-in big old eye lenses in their helmets. These can attach to a lot of different systems. They can share information. They can share targeting data. And I think that the quote-unquote stabilization of the weapon has a lot more to do with keeping the targeter essentially straight in the Tau's vision, and maybe it does something to allow this muzzle reference sensor or this camera device on the front of the gun to see where the Tau wants to aim, and it either rotates the energy ejector or kind of shifts the barrel in that direction, slightly, or it keeps you from having your weapon get jerked around and losing your targeting sight, essentially. So the gyroscopic stabilization is really just an ability for the weapon to either slightly course correct the fire, or a way that the weapon just has an automatic targeter, and it allows the Tau to understand, okay, that's exactly where my weapon is going to fire. And while this exists in Imperial arsenals, it seems to be more related to the helmet than it does to the weapon. So for the Tau, it seems to be both. It seems to be either or and or both of those things. So either it's moving the muzzle reference or something like that, or it's telling you where the weapon is aimed, and it helps you to actually aim it without necessarily looking down sights or anything like that, because their helmets are very high tech and allow them to identify targets even far away and kind of calculate where their weapon is supposed to be aimed. So it could allow you to do something like aim really high up or at some sort of a distance with the weapon and correctly calculate the distance at which you need to be firing or the angle that you need to fire at, even if it doesn't auto-correct it for you. So, not sure about that. I think it's arguable, especially because it's called a gyro stabilizer, and it talks about making sure that shaking hands can't throw your shot off. Again, these things don't have a barrel, so I think it has more to do with being a muzzle reference sensor and possibly a slight adjustment to your target or to the weapon's extruder of energy than anything else. Oh, man. So, drones. Drones are a thing that the Tau use a lot. And even the Fire Warriors will have these in their units. They have them for two reasons, basically. The first one is support. The drones literally act as kind of a pre-warning, as a pre-warning and also an extra weapon system. Some Tau, especially the Pathfinders, have heavier drones that operate with larger weapons, like pulse cannons or things like that. But in general, they will be equipped with standard infantry weapons, and they will float above the Tau and act as little extra, almost like a sentry gun. They're little helpers. Some of them are mobile, some of them float, some of them don't. And we'll talk about those more later, the ones that don't. But for the ones that just go with the Fire Warriors, they're generally these. They're kind of flat, disc-like. They have central communication systems that hook up to all of the, Tau kind of battle net of their armor and equipment and order systems. And they support them in combat that way. The other type of drone warfare is specific types of drones that mess with the enemy. So there are EMP drones, a lot of EMP weapons for the Tau, or just various types of EMP options, which I don't know how that doesn't affect their own stuff more than it does the Imperials, because the Imperials don't use robots whatsoever, and their electrical systems are relatively tough. But yeah, either way, the big thing with the drones that mess with people is they have marker drones. So marker drones either float near an enemy target and essentially illuminate them or point them out with like a little waypoint on their HUD, or they coordinate targeting data for other units. So a drone will fly above the battlefield or fly nearer to an enemy, identify like 5 dudes in a defilade 300 meters. If you charge them or if you aim your gun up, you'll be able to hit them like this. And it'll essentially give a firing solution to the squad and help them with their tactical identification of threats and enemies. So that's the two way that drones get used. I tend to not emphasize how good these guys are because they're generally deployed either in large swarms or as kind of just like extra support troops. So they're not a super important thing that is necessarily a make or break deal for the Tau. Like they can fight without drones and still be pretty effective, but the drones just give them an extra layer of support and help with, asymmetrical warfare like spotting. The tactics for the Fire Warriors. These guys have some big advantages. They have universal deployment. Generally, they're transported via mechanized forces. I believe they have a specific type of transport. I forget the name of it. It's on another slide. What is it called? Oh my goodness, I'm losing my mind. It's not the Orca, it's the other one. Whatever it is, Manta, something. Some fish-related thing. But they have the ability to essentially be mechanized infantry with support vehicles or battle taxis of their own, and they're relatively quick-moving, even if they're not traveling with a battle taxi. So, they're also everywhere. They are the front line and the battle line of most Tau armies. They are the most common soldiers on the field, on average, and technically they also are employed when any other force is in the field as foot troops. Tactical aggression. So, while you may think that the Fire Warriors tend to be very long-ranged, the weapons that they actually have tend to be very medium or, on average range. Las guns will outrange most Tau weaponry unless it's a rifle or a sniper's rifle, which they do have in abundance, and plenty of their weapons can reach out and touch at, 300 meters with more accuracy than a las gun will. But, outside of that, we're talking 500,000 meters, anything beyond that, there are other weapons that the Imperials have that will be better, specifically heavy weapons and sniper rifles, long lases, and even las guns. While they lose effectiveness over 500 meters, they can still effectively reach out and touch a lot of the Fire Warriors who are equipped, especially with pulse weapons. Since pulse weapons have a limited range, again, the sniper rifles have longer range, and the rifles have slightly better than average plasma weapon range, they can still get outranged by las guns. Even if at that range the las guns aren't going to do a ton of damage to them, it still means that they need to get up close and dirty, and they have an inherent need, and especially the ones with smaller pulse weapons, they have an inherent requirement to be aggressive. They need to be on the offensive. They need to be running into enemy defenses, ensuring that the heavy weapons that could counter their overwhelming firepower advantage are taken out or taken care of. And they can apply point pressure. Now, point pressure essentially means that when other units are performing the big Montka, the big push, this wide front offensive with its little specific discrete offensive that are going on in between them, the complicated multi-point blitzkrieg that is a true Tau offensive because they're very good at planning all of these aggressive moves ahead of time. The Fire Warriors act as both the battle line that are all moving forward, and they also do trickle-through attacks. What are trickle-through attacks? It means that when a Fire Warrior gets through a position, he isn't going to start moving laterally. He isn't going to go left once he goes through a trench line. He's going to penetrate one line and then head for the next. He will continue moving upward and essentially just keep jumping lines of defense so that he can get into backline areas faster. Now, why is this? Most forces worry about securing land, overall about taking land and holding it. The Tau don't care so much about that. They care more about just this overwhelming continued offensives, shattering enemy lines of defense via simply penetrating in so many places that they can overwhelm anything that's static ahead of them. So this point pressure, this idea that the Fire Warrior doesn't care about necessarily getting behind enemy lines or being overly aggressive because he knows that the rest of the force is aggressing with him, and the holes and the weaknesses that he makes are going to help secure a victory on the battlefield. So, variants and special tactics. Essentially, the strikers, the strike groups, they act kind of like rangers or standard infantry. They tend to have a lot of rifles, so they can reach out and touch at that more 300-meter medium infantry range. A perfectly respectable range, even if the las gun outranges it, and the bolt gun as well. But, still very respectable range, and they, of course, bring along much longer range weapons like sniper rifles and things of that nature. And then the breachers are close assault. They will often have the pulse weapons that can have a little bit more of a shotgun effect. They have, tend to have some heavier armor. You can see this is probably a breacher. He's got the big shoulder shield. Again, I don't put this stuff as equivalent of carapace armor. It's definitely more in the caliber of heavy flak or full flak. But they are more assault. They're definitely more on the aggressive side. These guys are dropping flash grenades all the time. They won't do as much long-range sniping or range taking out or, the cool, calm, precise strike combat that the strikers do, where they're going in, identifying enemy targets, executing them with their long weapons, and then pushing on progressively. The breachers are just running in a direction, killing everything that's in their way, and then continuing to run. They are very aggressive, and they will be the ones to go after more entrenched enemies, whereas the rangers would prefer to take on things that are out in the open, because their weapons are very precise, and they tend to have a lot more drones and stuff with them, and their weapons are longer range than the average Tau weapon. So, the worst weapons against the Tau. Against these two guys, against the Fire Warriors, your worst possible option is probably setting up in a way where you are relying upon basic infantry weapons to do a lot of the killing, and the biggest thing is diffusing your forces. For the Fire Warriors, they want to penetrate. They want to get through the front line of defenses and continue on to logistical areas because their command and control is going to be better than that of the PDF and theoretically better than that of the Guard in some cases. Especially if an Ethereal is on the field or if they've had a lot of time to plan the offensive and they haven't gotten blunted in the first few days of deployment. So, worst option would be to spread out a lot of guys who don't have really great weapons. Again, we're talking semi-automatic auto weapons and things like that, and have no support weapons and no defensive structures. With that, you're probably just going to get absolutely ran over and ran through. You may not lose a whole bunch of guys, but you're going to get the defensive line penetrated, and a whole bunch of Fire Warriors are going to show up somewhere where they're not supposed to be, and there's not much you can do about it. Their armor is pretty good against standard stub and auto weapons. Again, heavy machine guns probably going to kill them outright. It'll probably penetrate, but they have a chance to get around it and not die, especially the breachers because they got some solid armor. And of course, there's always the fact that, you'd have to hit them squarely. There are problems with making sure that you get an actual lethal hit. They're not much tougher than humans are. Matter of fact, they're probably a little bit weaker in some cases, but yeah, there's no particular thing that makes them more durable. So, acceptable weapons against them. I would say probably the best option here is the lasgun. And this is for a couple of reasons. One, you do have the ability to outrange the standard Tau and especially the breachers with lasguns. While you won't penetrate the armor necessarily, sending a couple of rounds their way, spraying them down with some automatic laser fire, is really, really solid. Now, here's the reason why. The Tau are not stupid, and they do have a very traditional army, which means that they have medics, and they take their, casualties and wounded back. Some of them might be ruthless enough, if pushed, to just leave the wounded behind or to execute them, but generally they won't do that. They tend to take prisoners, and of course they take care of their wounded or injured. So, lasguns have an advantage of being able to wound, but the other big advantage with the lasgun is taking down the drones. So, the drones are annoying, they're going to be constantly up in your face, you can't really hide from them all that easily, and with a standard infantry weapon, like a machine gun or an auto gun or something like that, it might be hard to get a direct hit on a drone. But with a lasgun, point-and-click weapon, basically very, very long range, you're going to be able to hose down drones and take them out pretty easily. They're not all that tough. Most of them don't have shields unless they're directed shield generator drones, which are usually found around suits, whether it's crisis suits or heavy suits, things of that nature. Battle suits, sorry. So, lasgun, I would say, is your most acceptable weapon here, for a lot of reasons. Mostly, again, for the wounding, for the outranging, and for killing the drones. The best weapons and tactics against the Fire Warriors, I would say, would be to concentrate units within areas where they can have some decent cover. So, concentrating units that the Tau don't necessarily know are there. So, you have a group of Imperial Guardsmen who are set up in an ambush position with a heavy bolter and a whole bunch of guys with lasguns. Every time that a drone comes over your area, you take it out with lasguns. Every time a squad shows up, you plaster them with the heavy bolter. You want that stud in your defense to essentially make sure that the Tau have to deal with it directly. You want them to have to bonsai charge the position. You want them to have to run a bonsai charge. there's a lot more that... I love how people call these, like, weeb tactics. Like, the Tau have a whole lot less to do with the Imperial Japanese Army than they have to do with a lot of other historical armies. The one, for me, that comes to mind is actually, like, the Turkish army from the 1600s, because they're very professional. They use a lot of weapons that might not be top grade, but they're well trained, they're well organized, and they use a lot of different forces and different force structures, including subversive tactics to the enemy. So I'd put them as more the Ottoman Empire than the Japanese Imperial Army. But, you know, the meme with them being weebs is already set in stone, so I'm not gonna rock the boat here. But you want them to charge a defensive position and take casualties, because not only does that slow them down, you're also having a relatively low injection of forces there. You know, a squad of Imperial Guardsmen that might be able to turn back 2 or 3 squads of Fire Warriors without getting knocked out. Now, if there are assets on the field that are preventing that, or that are directing their fire towards those forces specifically, then you're going to want to get them a little bit more mobile, and you're going to want to get them on the offensive. So that's the other thing. You want to attack the Tau. I am describing defensive tactics here only as a backup or a fallback. What you want to do is organize a way to aggress upon the Fire Warriors. Their build is very aggressive. It's very jumping, very move forward, very flashbang and laser burn everything to death, and consistently reducing enemy defenses. If you turn the momentum around, if you isolate the Fire Warriors from other assets, you know, everything on the Tau side is advancing, and then all of a sudden a counterpunch comes through, and it's just Fire Warriors holding the line, because they were expecting this to not be a heavy enemy resistance area, you could pretty easily slaughter them outright, especially if you have like a couple squads of Guardsmen. They are going to hit either equal or above their weight when fighting Fire Warriors on the back foot. Because if you catch them with no defenses, if you catch them out in the open, gun them down. There's nothing that's really stopping you, and there's very little that they can do about it, other than put up some last-ditch defenses or try and run. So, big thing there would be to be on the offensive, or to stud your defenses with more elite, more flexible units like guard infantry squads. Since we have line units, since we have 3 regiments of line infantry, we can do that. So, moving on to light troops and scouts, and this will also include some of the auxiliaries of the Tau forces. Deployment and usage. This includes the Kroot, the Vespids, humans, the worst scum in the 41st millennium, and Pathfinders, kind of. I don't know if I count Pathfinders in this, because they're kind of just strike squads with more scouts and more sniper rifles than the average scout squad, but they do deploy differently, so I guess it matters. These guys are used as fodder, they're used as variety, and they're used to fill gaps. So, humans, and to a degree the Kroot, are kind of used as cannon fodder by the Tau. They're used to throw at targets that the Tau armies just aren't working against, or they're used to fill in gaps where the Tau don't have the forces, or don't have the correct tuned forces, so the Kroot are very melee-oriented. The humans in the Tau army can be melee-oriented, but they tend to work like Fire Warriors, just, you know, human. They're a lot more aggressive, they're a little bit more tactically intelligent. Again, not calling Tau stupid, just saying that the Tau themselves describe how tactical and professional their humans in their armies are. So I'm saying what the Tau say. I'm not saying that this is my opinion. I'm just saying that the Tau say that the humans that they work with are very tactical and professional, even when compared to Fire Warriors. So, that's the 3 things. For the Pathfinders, they are a striker with drone scouting capabilities. So they're a very ranger-ish unit, they're very, like, mobility-based, and they use heavier scout, they have a heavier scout focus, and they use drones to accomplish that focus, including having some heavy weapon drones. Weapon analysis. So for the Kroot, they have melee weapons, which, sounds kind of small, but the thing is, they have Kroot rifles, which are kind of like crude, not necessarily all that crude, but pretty crude, stub rifles. So kind of like old Earth bolt action or single breech loading weapons. They're usually pretty high caliber, but these Kroot are not that smart. And while they are genetically modified or kind of shaped or built, quote unquote, to be better fighters, they kind of rely on their inbuilt strength, their size, their height, all that stuff. They are these green, muscly guys to use their melee weapons to overcome their enemy. On the one side, they are a pretty much melee predominant unit, or that's how the Tau use them. On the other side, they are a melee unit, which the Tau don't really have all that many of. They kind of rely on firearms a lot. So when an enemy comes in who is totally superior in melee weapons, and the Tau don't have a way to kill them with ranged weapons, the Kroot are a good option. If not to kill them outright, to use as cannon fodder, and to hold down that enemy while you get some assets that can actually kill them. Vespids. Vespids use one of the most confusing and annoying versions of weapons that I have ever had to analyze in my entire career thus far. They use neutron weapons, which are a crystal-enhanced laser ionizer. So they are ion weapons. They are using that same cluster of excited atoms that are positively charged in that same ion type of way, like the Tau weapons are, but inside of their guns is a crystal that is providing the ions for this material that is inherently explosive. So it's kind of like a laser that hits and detonates. So this material, these ions, are spraying at a target, so it goes like a enhanced laser weapon, but it has the advantage of also exploding or having some kinetic explosion along with it. That or some enhanced penetration. It isn't really clear. To me, that seems like it should have an explosion, as the crystal does explode when the Vespids are not beating their wings around it. Again, this is a really weird thing where they say that the crystal will detonate if a Vespid isn't holding it. What happens when they put the gun down exactly? Does it just blow up like a hand grenade? What if somebody else has to service the weapon? I think it's implied that a living being has to be close to the crystal in order for it to explode, either because it's unstable or there's something about it that is vibrational. But it almost reminds me of like Blastonium or Explodium from the Halo needle weapons, except it doesn't work exactly like that. So the neutron weapons, just kind of, it's a laser gun that also explodes. That's kind of how I've gotten to it. The laser is probably on par with a multi-laser in strength, probably a little bit weaker than that. But it also has the advantage of detonating, so it does a little bit more armor penetration than the multi-laser does. And then finally for the Pathfinders, extra large drones and blast cannons. So, blast cannons are a thing, they're rotary pulse weapons essentially. So they're automatic, medium caliber pulse weapons. On the one side, fully automatic version of a pulse weapon. Really cool. On the downside, these are heavy. They're pretty much only for suits and for these extra large drones that the Pathfinders use. And these extra large drones, in addition to the other drones that the Pathfinders have, allow them to have a lot of extra assets on the battlefield. So, tactics. They fill in where the Tau fail, where the Fire Warriors can't do the job, or the Fire Warriors don't have a niche that they can fit into. You know, we talked very specifically, they're very offensive, they're very jumping through enemy defenses, they like to reduce forces via shock. Where that fails, where the shock doesn't set in, where there's enough thickness in the enemy defense that the Fire Warriors get turned back, these guys are brought in, either because they are cannon fodder, or they have some special little gap in the capability net that they fill. And when they're not being used for that, you know, the Vespids can fly, they're like flying cavalry, the Kroot can do melee, they're very aggressive, the humans can be very tactical and organized in a much more professional fighting unit, often with specialized human weaponry that they stole, the absolute scum, but yes. And the other thing, when they're not doing that, is they range around the corners of a fight. So while the front line of the Blitzkrieg is made up of Fire Warriors, and it will be punctuated with tanks, crisis suits, squads of those things, battle suits, all that stuff, and supported by aircraft. The edges of the fight, the kind of areas where enemies would seek to send out scouts, try and do counteroffensive, going around the edge of the enemy line, that's where these scouts and light troops are going to be located, because Most of them are not all that well armored. They're not all that well protected. They could probably be taken down by standard infantry weapons, and they're relatively quick moving in comparison to the fire warriors. So they will be ranging out on the edges of a fight, keeping in enemy forces, and dealing with enemy scouts. Variants of special tactics. So we have increased aggression, shock, and mobile drone warfare. So this is really the thing where they have a very specific niche. Obviously, like I said, humans, Kroot, and Vespid are one specific thing, where they each have their own way of warfare that is very specific to how they operate and how they get that aggression and shock thing off to continue the Mot-Ka. Then mobile drone warfare is for the Pathfinders. They're very mobile, they're rangers, they're scouts, they have a lot of snipers and a lot of drones, which means that they can relay information very well, they can support themselves, they can identify and tag enemy units for allied units, those marker drones coming back in again. So lots of different things. None of these guys are really built to penetrate defenses as much unless they're being used as cannon fodder to essentially hold up an enemy force or to shove down their throats so that the fire warriors can come in and mop up what's left. The worst weapons against these guys, I would say it's different for each of them. For the Kroot, you really don't want to meet the Kroot in melee combat if you're a human. They are big, they are strong, their weapons are nasty, and they are pretty beefy, honestly. They are tough bastards. So you don't want to run at the Kroot and get into melee. You prefer to use anything else against them. For the humans, almost the same exact rules apply as the Fire Warriors, and since I don't like them, I will just point you to the Fire Warriors video and tell you exact same thing applies with the humans. Then with the Vespids, the worst possible option is anything that doesn't have fully automatic fire. And the other thing is, you need to be aware that the Vespids are there. It's one of the things that I'm really concerned about with them as a defender is, oh my god, my enemy has flying units that are human-sized that can just move around and mess around with my support units, kill my logistics, transports, all that stuff, and their weapons are pretty nasty, so sending standard infantry against them is probably not the best option, but spreading those infantry out to areas where they can cover more of your vulnerable areas are a better option. Pathfinders, the worst possible thing would be to send out a lot of light scout troops to try and deal with them. Pathfinders are pretty darn good at just outranging their enemy with a bunch of sniper rifles and taking them out at a distance, and then running at them with a bunch of drones and killing them outright. So, small little units of scouts that you send out, the Pathfinders are going to be able to deal with them. Acceptable weapons. For the Kroot, heavy machine guns and light machine guns. Anything that's fully automatic and has some decent punch to it, that'll work pretty well against the Kroot. Las guns are not a terrible idea, but you would definitely want something pretty beefy, and you don't necessarily need the multi-roll option of the las gun. So I would even say that grouping up PDF troopers and having them focus fire, 10 or 15 of them to every Kroot warrior, wouldn't be unreasonable, and considering that we have 500,000 PDF troops to work with, that's not an unreasonable thing. You could even have, anti-Kroot squads, 50 or 60 PDF troops, all of whom are equipped with semi-automatic rifles, and their one and only job is to walk around with big old bayonets, and they see Kroot, they all volley fire against them as much as possible, or they have a bunch of 3-ton trucks or other civilian vehicles that they essentially sit on the back of and troll the Kroot around and kill them with ranged weapons. Now again, the Kroot do have rifles, but a bolt action or a semi-automatic rifle is probably going to fire faster than the Kroot weapons. Vespids. I think the acceptable weapon with the Vespids probably would be the lasgun. Again, they have carapace armor, but it is biological, and we know from Gaunts and Hormagaunts that lasguns absolutely Shrek these guys. And so I'd say for a flying unit, you would want a point-and-click weapon. A lasgun will work very well against them. Heavy machine guns or light machine guns might work against them as well, but not as well as they will against the Kroot. Humans, again, scum. Just normal things that worked against fire warriors will work against them. Lasguns works fine. Machine guns works fine. Pathfinders, most acceptable against them would be to either have individual units haunt the Pathfinders, essentially. So sending out 1 or 2 scouts in independent units so that the Pathfinders are constantly dealing with enemy fire. They might be better snipers than you, But if you have 70 or 80 snipers in individual teams of 1 or 2, lying low in very good cover, essentially in the path of where the Pathfinders are going or where they've been operating, they can pick off the Pathfinders, and since you will have more of your guys than they will, you're going to pretty quickly be able to wear them out, or wear them ragged. They do need resupply and logistics, like all other factions do, so, or like all the other Tau do, so sending a lot of light counter-skirmish or counter-scout troops out in individual teams to ensure that they can't just get dealt with all at once is a pretty solid tactic against them. And since they are wearing the lighter version of Fire Warrior armor, not the kind with these big flat plates or the big shoulder pieces, they're more thinner, their arms are exposed, their stomachs are exposed, they just kind of have a breastplate. It's a lot closer to... The Pathfinders and the Standard Strike teams are a lot closer to regular flak armor. Still the faced kind, so pretty good standard guard issue, but not as good as the true Fire Warriors or the Breachers. So, acceptable still against them. The auto weapons will still be acceptable against them. Best weapons against them, sorry, this is confusing because I'm going back and forth. Best weapons or tactics against the Kroot, outrange them. Outrange them, absolutely. They are not all that smart. They have low cunning. I kind of equate them to orcs in a way. But they're not incredibly smart, and they can be stealthy. So you would want to have a lot of folks who have good range and good situational awareness. Maybe get them into an urban setting and kill them there piecemeal. Because of their, limitation to foot, they're not having a lot of firepower individually, you could probably kill quite a few of them with just a bolt-action sniper rifle and a couple of units that are constantly moving around. So if you're in one of those urban settings, one of those mining cities, anything like that, and Kroot show up to either get rid of some specific unit or just because they've been deployed there, if they're on the edge of the force, start harassing them, essentially, and you will be able to draw them into offensive they shouldn't be doing. You should be able to distract them and kill them off without suffering too much damage on your side of things. Vespids, I'd say the best thing with Vespids would be to equip a lot of your units with autocannons that have flak rounds. Even swarms of Vespids will go down if you have autocannon flak rounds, and since you could get lower caliber autocannons, and especially because we have the guard here, they might have support autocannons, load up a couple of sets of flak rounds, you can blow entire groups of Vespids out of the air with relative ease, and you can also outrange their weapons by a solid amount. For the humans, best possible option here would be... I would say the best option to kill other humans as a human would be to bring heavy weapons to bear. Heavy bolters, heavy machine guns, autocannons, entrenched and dug in with durable protection. Doesn't matter how tactical you are or what special futuristic weapons the Tau gave you. If you take a heavy bolter round to the chest, you're going to die. And so, overwhelming them and killing them out, because generally humans won't be deployed in huge numbers with the Tau. In some numbers, but less than the number of Fire Warriors in general, and usually a lot less. Kill them, heavy weapons. Pathfinders. Best possible option with Pathfinders would probably be to ambush them outright. Now, I had acceptable as giving individual units out in the field against them. It's harder to do an ambush against the Pathfinders, but it is a much more secure way of making sure that they die. They are out and independent a majority of the time, they're way away from support, and while they have their drones to do some good scouting for them, if you can attrition the drones down to be less effective or less numerous, or if you could just catch them all at once with a mobile force, sending out a squad of mechanized guardsmen, or a couple squads of folks who have some support weapons, and laying a trap in somewhere where you can remain concealed. Say, the Tau have cleared out a defensive structure a few miles behind the lines, or away from the battlefield. You send a unit out there into an area that the Tau think is clear, they come through with a Pathfinder unit, you obliterate them. You will have the firepower advantage, and if you can get a surprise advantage, you can kill them pretty easily. So, moving on to the bruisers of the Tau army. I'm going to try and speed this up just a little bit. Stealth suits, including the big old ghost keel and the standard stealth suit, the smooth boy down here. And then crisis suits. So, these are used either as infiltrators or mobile fire support. They have plasma, fusion, melta, heavy weapons, often of the pulse or ion variety, though they often have armor-piercing weapons like the fusion guns or like big old plasma weapons. The stealth ones, the stealth suits and the ghost keel, they are mobile tactical support and or swift strike units. So all these guys, the suits have either jump packs or the ability to move very fast. The stealth suits all have the ability to essentially haul around drones that can literally make them invisible, or at least partially invisible. This has some advantages and disadvantages that we'll talk about in a second, but in general, these guys are a force multiplier for the Fire Warriors. They will come in squads of 5 to 10, and they will organize in such a way that they are hitting with their heavy weapons where the Fire Warriors couldn't overcome the enemy. And because of their mobility and because of their stealth, they have the ability to do that and then jump to another target that is resisting them heavily. So they kind of work as on-call fire support, almost like artillery. They will hear something bad is happening to a unit or hear that there's some obstacle in the way, or they will know that ahead of time during the planning phase. They will hop over on their jump packs to the next target, they will reduce it with their heavier weapons, and then they will continue on with the fight. So, special tactics. The stealth drone. This essentially creates a kind of camera field or a projection that there is no suit. This does mean that there are a lot of drones kind of around these suits, especially the larger ghost keel. And these ones generally do not have shields. It tends to be only the larger ones. The ghost keel might, but generally they will have shield generators from the drones or stealth generators, but the ones that I can guarantee have shields that aren't like carried on their hands are the much larger heavy suits that we'll talk about in a bit. Crisis suits tend to not have shields. Standard suits of stealth armor don't have shields. So their protection is essentially just a medium alloy, which we'll talk about in a second. Range issues. Now, why do I say that there are range issues with these? Generally, something that has this much mobility also has some long-range accurate weapons. That doesn't seem to be the case with a majority of these suits. They tend to still have either pulse or ion weapons, which we talked about, are inferior when compared with the range of the weapons that are going to be used on the equivalent bruisers in other forces. So, tanks and stuff will definitely outrange these. Most heavy infantry weapons can outrange them, but because of the mobility, they will often make up for that by being sheerly aggressive, or by turning on their stealth field and becoming invisible. On the other side of things, the stealth field is not infallible. There are ways to track them with thermals, there are ways to track them with infrared detection software, which the Imperium does have pretty often, either in hive form with auspex, or occasionally with weapon scopes. And the other important thing is essentially resupplying these units. They're going to have to be hopping in and out of combat a lot of the time. They're going to be taking a lot of damage. And if they get immobilized, they're going to be in a position where it's very hard to resupply, support, or save them. So that can be a problem. The final thing is protection, and so with deployment, they are brought in kind of as Jimmy-on-the-spot support weapons, or they're sent in as stealth troops to help with an infiltration or breakthrough, while not looking like so much of a threat, because again, invisible or very hard to see. The big issue that I have with these is that their protection is a nanocrystalline hyper alloy. Now this reminds me a lot of aluminum alloy armor, such as was used on the M113 carrier back in the day. These are not dreadnoughts. They are not armored anywhere close to the same level that a dreadnought is. Even the ghost keel, it says, can be penetrated by like regular heavy infantry weapons. I would say something like a heavy bolter would probably put a quick end to a crisis suit. And a stealth suit could probably get killed by some concentrated infantry fire. You know, probably not easily, but at least it could be disabled by it. So, I have an issue with their protection. They definitely are vulnerable to a lot of different stuff. While some drones can take hits for them, I would not rely on a drone saving my life. And the armor protection, even of the crisis suits, is pretty easy to overcome with something like a heavy bolter or an autocannon. So, people often look at these as being very hard to kill. I would say that that's not the case, or at least that their armor is much more vulnerable to heavy weapons than it looks. Especially on tabletop, these things have like 3-up saves and then 4-up invulns for a drone taking a hit for them. That's not how it works in reality or in practice. Again, they're not any more heavily armored than most light vehicles. So I would definitely put them on the light armor category, with the Ghost Keel maybe edging into medium. But even so, heavy infantry weapons and any designate armor-piercing weapon will make a mess of most suits. I would even question using hell guns against crisis suits or against stealth suits. I think against stealth suits, a hell gun would absolutely mess it up, kill the guy pretty quickly. But against crisis suits, it would not be unreasonable, in my opinion, to say that a couple of dudes with hell guns or with hotshot las guns could incapacitate or destroy a standard crisis suit without a ton of difficulty. So, worst possible weapons against these are standard infantry weapons, and I would say a big one that is kind of a trap that you would fall into is using light machine guns against these very mobile units. So that'd probably be the worst option. Most acceptable option, I would say, is anything that is light armor piercing or an infantry weapon that's designate armor piercing. So, loading up some specialty AP ammo into your standard issue rifle, hotshot packs, hell guns, hotshot las guns will, I would say, absolutely slaughter the light stealth suits, kill the crisis suits with a little bit of effort, and then probably be able to incapacitate the Ghost Keel with a lot of effort or with some friends to help you. So, that's your acceptable weapons. I'd say the best weapons against these, another acceptable one would be medium or light caliber autocannons and heavy bolters. I think heavy bolters just work really, really well. They're almost like a perfect mid-ground against the crisis suits and the standard stealth suit. But against the Ghost Keel, I think the heavy bolter would have a little bit of a harder time, just because I don't think it would penetrate. I think it would explode outside of the armor, which means that you'd have to focus a whole lot more on it, and the Ghost Keel is fast, and it's mobile, and it has very heavy armor-piercing weapons, so you'd want to have a couple of dudes with heavy bolters focusing on it. Best possible weapon and tactics against these guys, I think having a mobile secondary force would be a very good tactic against these guys. Again, I didn't give us any armored or light armored vehicles for this Adversaries, but that doesn't mean that we can't do things like grab a couple of train cars or trolley cars or just public transit or just vehicles in general, mount up maybe a heavy bolter or an autocannon into the vehicle itself, and then keep it in a garage somewhere, and then when crisis or stealth suits show up in an area, ring, 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 like a fire alarm goes off for them, and then they go off and they quickly go and deal with that unit. Now, they are both vulnerable to each other's weaponry, but that's acceptable for the Imperial Guard. They are willing to do that. What you don't want to do with that, you might think, well, I have a lot of heavy bolters in this area. They can appear behind you, they can jump down right on top of you. You want to have a decent amount of mobility in order to counter these guys, just in order to keep your heavy weapons on target, you know? If they're stuck into a defensive position, or if they're on a wall or something, like with the artillery, they're going to be able to get around it. You want to have some, especially around things like assets, like anti-aircraft or artillery, you want to have some other people who are ready to deal with these mobile suits. And we'll get into that a little bit with in-placed artillery. So, vehicles. It's the Devilfish. I forgot that was the name. Devilfish. So, designated transports or battle taxis. We have the Devilfish, which is up here. It's got kind of that rotor cannon looking thing that is also a pulse weapon. And the Orca. The Orca is a big fat whale ship which takes stuff from orbit to ground. For Army, we have the heavy battle suits. I'm not sure exactly what this one is, but this is one of the heavier ones. Big old plasma cannon and a whole bunch of smart rockets and missiles. And then the Riptide and other ones like it. You see it has like a shield / melee weapon here and a fusion blaster, kind of like combo between big plasma weapon and melta weapon. And then Riptide, the heavier versions of the Ghost Keel and the other things. The Tau Nar and the Tau Awa or whatever. And the other heavy battle suits also fit into this area. They just tote a lot of extra weapons, and some of them have specific designs with different weapons on them. For their tanks, they have gunships and swordfish. These are pretty much all equipped with little micro missiles, some anti-infantry weapon, and then a heavy anti-armor weapon. Usually it's a Tau railgun. Sometimes it's a fusion weapon or a big old ion or plasma weapon. Then finally, for the aircraft, we have the Piranha, the Mansa, and the Barracuda. The Tau utilize close air support pretty often, not only because they have a very integrated battle net with all of their drones and communication sharing devices, it's also because they rely on a very low-weight navy that a lot of their vessels can carry attack craft, and those attack craft will often work in the air as well as on the ground. Or in space, sorry. Then finally, we have drones. I don't have any pictures of them here, though you can see a couple of them floating around in the pictures. I'll talk about how they work, but you have stationary drones that work like turrets, deployable drones that work like the ones with the Vanguard troops, or these troops here that kind of have an infantry weapon, and then the tactical drones, which serve as helpers for the battlesuits. Either they project a field, whether it's a shield or a stealth suit, or they do targeting data for the big suits, and they can also take hits for them in theory. Again, on tabletop, they can take hits from like big, heavy anti-tank weapons and make it so that the battlesuit takes no damage. That's not how that works in real life. If a drone gets hit with a 120mm armor-piercing shell, it's still going to hit the battlesuit, and it will still do a lot of damage to it. Physics not applying to tabletop here. So, deployment usage. For all the transports, they are pretty common mechanization. They will transport fire warriors. They will occasionally transport other units as well. And they will work as active fire support. Though they are less armed than an Imperial Chimera, they are much more mobile because they are kind of hovercraft-esque units. And then finally, when I was talking about the Mont-Ka and the forward line of aggressive troops of fire warriors, punctuated with particularly dangerous, overwhelming firepower assets, that concentrated armor support are those punctuation marks. The specific high-pressure impacts that the Tau use to focus all of their firepower on one target, make sure that they penetrate the line, and then continue their bounding advance, their constant aggressive push, the Tau Blitzkrieg, even further. Now, weapon analysis. Heavy weapons and heavy AT are the absolute name of the game with the battlesuits especially, but also with the tanks. And a big thing here is railguns. So, Tau railguns have become a point of contention within the hobby. Some people hate them, some people love them. Some people say that they're not actually railguns because they have explosive in them. Some people say that they are even better than modern-day railguns, or they're any type of things. Tau railguns seem to me to work off of very similar logic to railguns in our reality. It is a magnetized object, whether it's a shell or a sabot. It tends to be some sort of shell, it seems, because there are descriptions of the railgun exploding on impact rather than just hitting. But I might be wrong there. That's just what I've interpreted from the details that they describe about it. But the penetration of the railgun seems to be a lot lower, possibly because of its smaller size. Like, if you've ever seen a railgun like they were working on with BAE Works, it's a very long barrel and a very large reactor for this energy weapon. Now, this one, the Swordfish and the other long gun railguns from the Tau tanks, they seem to have the size a little bit more down. But the Tau battlesuits, some of them get it right. Some of them have something like this. I believe the Riptide has one. But some of them have a little bit more like this, where it's a shoulder mount, or it's a really big arm mount that takes up like the entire energy of the battlesuit to use. And then some of them have very small ones that they still call railguns, but are a lot shorter. And I think that that means, like with any weapon, the smaller version is going to be less effective, the bigger version is going to be much more effective. So, either way, very good AT, very good long-range shooting. They have great range. The one complaint that I have is people talk about the railgun being a very good artillery weapon, and this is one of my big gripes with the Tau. I don't think they have a single real artillery weapon, an indirect fire weapon. People say that they can get indirect hits with the railguns because they can calculate how to hit a target that's far away. The railgun is entirely based on initial velocity, and generally it loses effectiveness and accuracy over range because it's not spin stabilized. Again, it can be stabilized, but it's generally not spin stabilized. And what's worse than that, it has a very straight trajectory. So there's a lot of dead space between the direct impact artillery, quote unquote, or heavy support weapon that is the railgun, and what you can really do with it. In addition, a lot of them are mounted in fixed positions, whether it's on a tank or on a battlesuit, so aiming this thing backwards or tilting it very heavily to get a almost near orbital trajectory not only defeats the purpose of a railgun being high velocity, but it also is a massive pain that can't be done with all of these things. So one of my big complaints is that the Tau, for all that they say that they have long range, that range does require basically direct line of sight to the target. So you're not going to be firing at things 15, 20, 30 kilometers away unless that thing is visible to you directly. So aiming over a target, over walls, using indirect fire artillery, not as common for the Tau. They tend to be very direct fire only. And that is kind of typified with railguns, because they are a straight line weapon for the most part. Smart missiles. This is a thing that the Tau have in abundance. The marker drones and the marker lights, things that the drones do that target an enemy, whether it's by marking them electronically or literally shooting them with something, I'm not exactly sure. But smart missiles are like homing missiles. They target in on a specific area and they pepper them. These can fire indirect, but they also tend to be very aggressive, so firing them up and then letting them go towards their target might be possible, but firing them a super long distance, they're probably going to hit the ground or run into something before then. They're not capable of in mid-flight correction to another target, for example, but they will track a single target that they've been directed to go towards, like a smart missile, like a homing missile. These tend to be around 60 to 40 millimeters. They're relatively small caliber missiles and rockets, so they're carrying, somewhere around a 40 millimeter high explosives grenades worth of explosive, which is a solid amount, but not all of them are armor piercing. While there are some armor piercing ones, they're not as common. And they tend to be more like area saturation weapons where they can hit a whole bunch of designated targets when they're all fired from a big battlesuit. So, great for saturation, great for hitting specific targets with multiple accurate shots, but pretty limited in their range for that whole tracking thing, and theoretically they can be used as dumb rockets as well, which I think is pretty cool. The last thing is their shields for the big battlesuits. Now, I call these jerky refractor fields because the specific ion shield, or whatever it is that the Tau use, it doesn't seem to be an actual ion field, because ion fields take a consistent amount of energy from the platform that is projecting them, whereas refractor fields act the way that the lore says that the Tau shields act, which is jerky. It pulls a lot of energy in order to project itself, but it seems like a lot of the Tau battlesuits not only have an internal jerky refractor field, they might also have Tau drones around that are projecting their own field that can get in the way of enemy attacks as well. So they might have some sort of extra layered refractor fields, but it also says that they take a huge amount of energy from the battlesuit, and considering that most Tau weapons are also energy weapons, it seems to me that these might be, even if they are of better technology than a standard Imperial refractor field, they might still suffer from the same issue of jerking into existence, overpowering, jerking out of existence, kind of appearing, disappearing, fluctuating with energy. Seems to be a pretty consistent thing with their shields. Tactics. So, with the Devilfish especially, you have the supportive battle taxi role where it's got both weapons and it can transport people. Then the other ones, the tanks and heavy battlesuits, and the aircraft, direct impact artillery and overwhelming direct or semi-indirect firepower. So, again, how I said it's direct impact artillery, it's at a target that you can see and identify, or semi-indirect firepower, like with the smart rockets, an enemy might be in cover, you might be able to angle the suit, fire the rockets up, and then they home in on the target. And of course, they have a lot of drones around to help out with that indirect firepower thing. But in general, the whole point of these is to be an overwhelming firepower asset that can get through stubborn defenses or tough knots in the enemy's protective ring that you're supposed to be able to get over. In addition to that, they are relatively mobile compared to the heavy tanks of the Imperium, so while they are on the offensive, they can actually keep up with the front line a little bit better. Some of the battlesuits are still ground-bound. They're not really able to move all that well. But things like the Riptide here, they can jump. They do have jump packs. And they're not just semi-mobile gun platforms like this one. So, high mobility, mass drone assistance, already went over that. Aggressive Overmatch, already went over that. They are the overwhelming aggressive version. And then Knight Stand-ins. So, Knight Stand-ins, the bigger battle suits are supposed to be equivalent to Imperial Knights in firepower, if not protection. Now, the battle suits are less armored than an Imperial Knight is. Yes. The battle suits are slightly more mobile on the light side of heavy, on the light side of heavy battle suits. They are more mobile than Knights are. But those smaller ones don't carry as much firepower. The really heavy ones are not more mobile than Knights, and none of them have the heavy ion shielding that Knights do. Now, ion shielding has its own issues, but against the energy weapons of the Tau, it has no problem. So, they are Knight stand-ins. They are the best Titan equivalent that's available, even though they pale in comparison to even the smallest of Titans. If you had a whole bunch of them, which the Tau often do have multiple battle suits, but not really heavy ones all that often. They might have 3 or 4 heavy battle suits, and then a couple of squads of 3 or 4 of the lighter heavy battle suits, like the Riptide. The more mobile ones. But even in that situation, you're probably going to have a lot more of them, and you can bring multiple of them to bear on a single target, but it is not easy. So, worst possible weapons against these guys, or the worst possible strategy, really, because only certain weapons will work against them. Worst strategy against these guys would be to spread out your defenses and allow them to get the maximum penetration off of their overwhelming firepower. So if you spread out all of your heavy weapons along the line, thinking that you're creating a nice impenetrable area, they will thank you, because they will intentionally go and put all of their firepower in one area just to penetrate through, and then you're the one having to retreat. They're the ones who are on the momentum, and the Tau are winning. Acceptable weapons or options. I keep putting weapons. That is a terrible typo that's been in multiple videos now. I'm sorry. Acceptable weapons. For the Devilfish, I would say a pretty solid one, since it is kind of got that hyper alloy armor. Best thing I would say here for the Devilfish would be crack rockets and missiles. Medium caliber autocannons are probably also a solid bet. I think heavy bolters aren't going to do as well because the armor of the Devilfish is very contoured and kind of flexed so as to make those bolt weapons not work as well. But autocannons can overcome it with velocity and with caliber, and crack weapons will absolutely blitz these guys. It'll be pretty effective against them. Missiles would be my best option here. For the armor, for the heavy battle suits, like the Riptide, I would say, for the Riptide and like the heavy one here, I forget exactly what this one is called, but for those big heavy battle suits, heavy artillery is probably your best option. So, bringing in the Guard 132mm Earthshakers, keeping them nice and protected, and then waiting for the heavy vehicles to commit, and then smashing them with heavy artillery is a very solid idea. So, you wouldn't want to be firing with heavy artillery all the time, because then the Tau aren't going to deploy these things. But when they do deploy them, when you get an opportunity to see them out in the open, you can identify them, you can locate their position, you can track on to where they're going to be, because they aren't as fast as the more, jetpack-capable mobile ones. The really big gun ones, you can smash them with artillery. That's a pretty solid option. For the aircraft, this is one of the ones where I was talking about I want to bring in line units, because line units get things like concentrated anti-aircraft options. So Hydra flak batteries are a great option against the Piranha and the Manta, and theoretically against the Barracuda as well. So those heavy 4-barreled anti-aircraft positions that are pretty accurate, and they can fill the sky with a lot of armor-piercing and flak rounds, they will allow you to maintain that umbrella that I was discussing about. The umbrella applies to all of these guys. It's the idea that if we can keep some medium weapons to keep the Devilfish from penetrating our lines, if we can keep some artillery to deal with all the battle suits, and if we can keep some anti-aircraft to deal with all of the aircraft, then we could keep these assets from being used how the Tau want them to. The Tau want to focus all their firepower, break a line, penetrate, and continue the on-rushing attack, the continued offensive. If we can stymie them and keep them from deploying where they want to, we can get them to slow down. The second they slow down, we begin an offensive against them. That keeps them on the back foot, and we don't let them get the momentum again, at any cost. With tanks, obviously the best weapon here, since they are a little bit closer to battlesuits and armor, would probably be to smash them with artillery. Though I'd also say with a lot of the Tau tanks, they don't have great anti-infantry, and especially their railguns tend to be pretty terrible against massed infantry. So having a bunch of guys with crack grenades, maybe rushing them with a lot of Imperial Guardsmen that have medium weapons, stripping them of their infantry protection, and then shooting things like their technological mobility pieces, the engine parts or the jet parts that are keeping them up, hitting them even with like medium infantry weapons, you'll be able to disable them, and then getting on board and killing them with crack weapons and things like that. Once they're immobilized, essentially. Don't come at them from directly in front, obviously, because all of their anti-infantry weapons are generally along the front edge. And from behind, from the sides, the only thing you'll have to worry about is the rotating weapons in these front sponsons, and if you can damage those or get close enough to not worry about them, you will be able to knock out these tanks pretty easily. But that's not a preferable option. The preferable option would be to hit them with something high caliber, like an artillery round, that can kill them that way, or crack weapons. So, last thing with drones. I'm only going to do one thing for drones. Generally, it's just massed firepower deals with drones. Fully automatic, shrapnel and explosives, fragmentation grenades. If you throw something at a tank or at a battlesuit, the drones will probably try and get in the way, whether they're shield drones or whether they're like suicide drones that will take a hit instead of letting the battlesuit do it. If you can distract them, toss a bevy of frag grenades and make all of them take the damage first, not only are you getting rid of really pesky, annoying drones, you're also able to make sure that you can fire something more lethal at the actual battlesuit. For stationary ones, you kind of just want to stay away from these, honestly. They have sniper rifles or missiles or things like that. They aren't super smart, and they have limits to how far they can see. So theoretically, you could just take like a standard las gun and just sit outside of their range and constantly shoot at them for a couple of minutes, and you will eventually disable them. That's the cheap, passive way of doing it. But anything else really will work. They're not all that well armored. It's kind of like a tin can with a weapon inside of it. Tactical drones, same thing. These are the ones floating around the battlesuits a lot of the time. You just want to saturate that area of fire, whether it's artillery or heavy machine guns or heavy weapons, and the drones will eventually die. Finally, best weapons and interesting tactics against these guys. For the devilfish, I would say identifying them first or keeping out scout units looking for them, and then plastering them immediately. You don't want them to get into your defenses, so having maybe a quick response force of artillery who's like maybe 10 barrels, and you can be like, oh, devilfish coming up the road there, and you can just smash them. Again, the devilfish can fly, but they tend to not be too far off the ground. If they are far off the ground, bring anti-aircraft artillery and just destroy them. For the armor, both for the tanks and for the heavy armor of the battlesuits, you want to have a core of artillery or a core of very heavy weapons. I'm talking heavy autocannons, wall guns, anything like that on standby, and essentially the ability to deploy and protect. So that part of that umbrella system is you need to have good communications up. Even if it's not within the guard, in this case it is the guard using them who have very good communications, but even if it's not the guard, you'd want to concentrate, protect those assets, and then keep a constant line of communication saying, battlesuit is here, battlesuit is entering this grid, battlesuit is entering this area, battlesuit is going into the target area, and then you'll keep a little box, and then boom, once they get into that area, box barrage them, smash them repeatedly, and you'll be able to knock them out, or at least disable them, or force them to disengage. Once they disengage, you send in an offensive where they disengaged from. So, then for the aircraft, so this is a part of the umbrella as well. You want to keep anti-aircraft units available close to the front line where anti-air units, or where air units or flying units that the enemy have will be able to be countered by them. Again, flak batteries, even just anti-aircraft autocannons, things of that nature, whether they're heavy and like hive-bound or whether they're on vehicles. Theoretically, you can rig up a technical basically with an autocannon and use that as mobile anti-air. Moving on to the smallest one of this, and the one that's going to get me into the most trouble. Leadership and command. We have suited commanders and the ethereals. The Ethereals are a backline quarterback. They kind of will either sit in orbit or they'll sit really far away, and they will command using their extreme charisma and their big brainedness to coordinate all of their forces. Suited commanders like Farsight, like Shadow Sun, are essentially very veteran Tau. They're very good at the fighting things that they do, and they have particular ways of war that are approved of to the point where they are put in charge of other units. So, they are midline tactical commanders. They will be not at the dead front of the fight, and they won't be pushing with the rest of the Fire Warriors. They and a squad of their bros will essentially be one of those particularly nasty impacts where they try and get overwhelming firepower, and they will push the Mont Ka, and they will ensure that the continued aggression is occurring. Weapon analysis. Generally, they will have unique suits. The Ethereals, as far as I know, don't really use anything other than some ceremonial weapons, since Tau will literally kill themselves rather than disagree with an Ethereal somehow. Again, some weird Maoist cult there. Not going to look too far into it. But Shadow Sun and Farsight both have unique weapons to go with their Crisis suits. And their Crisis suits are also obviously going to be bedecked and outfitted with a lot of extra stuff that's more fancy and marks them as a commander. Tactics. So, on the side of the Ethereals, they inspire fanaticism within their troops. They can encourage Tau to stick around long after it would be tactically viable in order to achieve an objective. They won't always do that, but that's something that they can do. And they can also ensure that there is no breakdown in communication with the Auxiliaries or anything like that. Ethereals can extend some of their powers to controlling things like Kroot, or kind of the dumber species within the collective. And they are also pretty good at employing those forces. They are acceptable as tactical commanders, even though the Tau tend to not use the Ethereals as often for that. They will have their own officers of different castes, like the Air caste, like the Fire caste, but the Ethereals can be, or usually are, in overall command. And then on the skill side, you have the suited commanders. These guys are basically just elevated because they're good at their job. That's really the end of it. You know, they might be particularly skilled at the blade, like Farsight, or they might be particularly skilled in tactics, like Shadow Sun, or in stealth or something like that, like Shadow Sun, but they're not necessarily all that different from the average Tau Crisis man. They're just particularly well-skilled and well-seasoned. Variants of special tactics. Again, most of them are in Crisis suits, some of them are in big ones, but most of them are in the standard ones just for mobility purposes. Commander Farsight is the one who I really want to talk about. Shadow Sun is cool, a little bit more standard, but Farsight's the one I wanted to talk about. I am very sorry to any Tau people, but I claim Farsight for Chaos. I claim this man for Chaos. He's one of us. One of us. One of us. I claim Farsight. He is not, if he's not a worshipper of the Chaos Gods, he is beloved of the Chaos Gods, and I will accept him as a Chaos unit. Thank you very much. The man summoned Cornate demons. He uses a demon sword. He is taking no shits from anyone, set up his own independent universe, or set up his own independent sept, the Farsight Enclaves, and basically said, screw you guys, I want to be independent. I claim him for Chaos. I claim him. He is one of ours. I respect the hustle, my man, but one day, you will be ours. I want Demon Prince Farsight so bad. Okay, that's a little bit of an overstatement, but you can see what I mean. Farsight has a relationship with the Warp that is not shared by basically any other Tau in the entire existence of the faction. Their souls are relatively weak. They tend to shun or be confused as to what Chaos is. They think of them as like angry, aggressive xenos or just more humans. Farsight, on the other hand, is carrying a literal demon weapon. There is an evil Chaos spirit inside of his sword that gives him special powers. And I believe it talks to him, if I've heard the books correctly. But either way, I claim him. I lay claim to this man. I love him. I love the fact that he stands up to the Ethereals and basically says, you guys are cramping my style, and you shouldn't be in charge just because you're good at talking. We need to be a little bit more warlike and violent. Again, tell me this man is not falling to corn, and tell me I'm not falling in love with that fact. But yeah, Farsight, I claim him. Me personally. You can disagree. That's fine. But I think that every single rebellion or secession from any established group will eventually lead to chaos. And since he rebels against the not necessarily the greater good as a whole, but at least against the Ethereals, I think chaos is going to seep in. And I think the fact that he literally unintentionally summons a bunch of bloodletters, and they don't necessarily try and kill him, I think that's evidence. I think that's good evidence that that he's one of us. So, worst possible weapons against these guys. Worst weapons are anything that can't reach them, basically. There's nothing that's necessarily super bad against Ethereals. They're not all that powerful physically. But against any of the normal guys, just don't be an unnamed character, essentially. You know, Farsight is going to absolutely cut you to ribbons. Shadow Sun is going to appear out of the darkness and turn your body into ashes if you're just a regular person on the run. Acceptable weapons, again, they're in Crisis Suits, so the things that work against Crisis Suits will work against them, but you have to keep in mind they will have a lot of drones with them, not to mention a squad of other bros in Crisis Suits. Best possible weapons, I actually want to see somebody with some decent melee chops fight against these guys. So, dueling them is probably the best way of getting rid of them, either because they will run, or theoretically because you can injure or kill them. Especially with, like, generic suited commanders, they're still not protected by any shields. Sniping them out, or sending up against them and going for a melee duel, they don't necessarily have a ton of melee weapons. They will try and shoot you with their weapons, but they're wrist-mounted or shoulder-mounted. You can get out of the way. You can force them out of the way with melee weapons. Big old Cornet Warrior with 2 chain axes runs up against a Crisis Suit. If he can avoid the first blast, he's probably going to rip it apart. So, dueling them, not a terrible idea. And it may be the best way to get rid of them. So, famous groups and how to disrupt logistics. I'm going to not do famous groups for this because the septs are relatively similar, even if they do things slightly different. But the really big thing for this is how to resist. So we're going on to our scenario now. I've talked about some of the systems, some of the things like that. This is a really great photo with all the dead Kroot and Tau and these two dudes killing each other. Containing the initial probe. So, that first go down, the diplomacy that we talked about, and the initial discussion, and the kind of rejecting them, and then dealing with all of the infiltrators, that's all been done. What you then want to do is send out a lot of the PDF, so I would say 100,000 guys, to essentially surround the Tau landing area and deal with any initial scouts, any drones, any random asymmetrical stuff that's coming out. These guys are absolutely going to die. They are a sacrifice worth making. But sending out these large groups of light scouts to harry the Tau, to keep them in one area, to identify where they are, and then also sending out your Imperial Guard infantry to make a whole bunch of noise. They don't necessarily have to be doing a ton, but starting artillery barrages up and then running away, or doing rolling or box barrages at random and then continuing the fight somewhere else. You know, hit and run tactics when the Tau are still getting their plan settled up and getting all of their forces down. You want to complicate that planning system. The other thing you want to do is show your hand in one place and then pop up in another one that the Tau weren't expecting. So, if you have a whole bunch of artillery, you want to move them covertly and quietly to one area, and then maybe set up another 2 areas, and then bombard from one area. When the Tau go and try and attack that area, you want to then get them with another set of artillery, and then another one, and then another one. And you want to complicate this and make them confused. Another thing, conceal your capabilities. Hide squads. Split up one of the regiments and make them into these, like, specific hard points that the Tau are going to have to deal with individually. If your PDF is making up kind of the bread of your plum pudding, you want your Imperial Guard squads or companies to be the plums. They're these kind of hard points around which the defense can coalesce, and that it takes more than a single squad of fire warriors to get rid of. So, between those three, between containing the initial probes, keeping them on the back foot, complicating their planning systems by moving a lot of systems and infantry units around, and then concealing your capabilities, hiding, ambushes, all that type of stuff, prepping for the Tau plans, and then going out of your way to be unpredictable is a very good way to get them on the back foot. And then what's the main goal, how to counter it? Again, Mot Ka. It's a very aggressive, continued, rolling blitz that includes overwhelming aggression, hardpoint destruction with overwhelming firepower, ignoring the main squishy part of your battle line, not getting caught up with it, and just applying massive amounts of pressure with little specific spearheads that can move around and change position. Umbrella and Scorpion. Umbrella and Scorpion is the way that I would deal with this. Umbrella is you prevent them from getting over or around your defenses with anti-aircraft, artillery, prepped support, layers of mobile resistance. So, again, those like street gangs of dudes with heavy machine guns going around the cities or traveling over land or protecting the inner areas of the hive. They're going to be dealing with things like stealth suits, Vespids, sneaky big stealth suits and stuff like that, or flying units or anti-aircraft. And then, once you have that down and you have the artillery to deal with the big battle suits and the tanks that are a little bit less mobile, once you've slowed that rolling blitz down, throw a hella counterpunch. You want to keep an entire regiment of line infantry in reserve, along with maybe 100,000 of your standard infantry. And it doesn't have to be a complicated counterpunch. This is one of my favorite things. It doesn't have to be a super specific thing like it was with the Space Marines, where you had to counter each of their units individually. The Tau are built for a continued rolling offensive. If you throw a huge haymaker offensive onto the right side of their line, it doesn't matter how strong or weak that side is, that front line that they have massively moving forward is going to collapse. It's going to roll up on itself, and you want to push that home. You want to force them to back up. You want to bloody yourself almost. You want to intentionally grind your own men in just to make damn sure that the Tau do not keep their offensive momentum rolling. Anything that you can do, not just to blunt, but to roll back up that continued blitz, and to force them to redeploy assets in ways that they don't want, that's how you use the counterpunch. And you could prep 1, 2, 3 of these. You'll outnumber them a majority of the time, even if your troops will get, destroyed on average at a higher rate, because yours are going to be less capable, especially with the PDF troops. That doesn't mean that they're not capable of killing the enemy, and it doesn't mean that they can't spread out or increase the weight of a counterpunch by just increasing the number of people that the Tau have to deal with. Fire Warriors, they're not super good on the defensive. They are made for offensive actions. The basic infantry guys, the light infantry, they're not made for heavy defensive fighting. They're made for aggressive fighting. If you can get them on the defensive, if you can reverse the momentum, that's how you get it. So, how to sustain? Call for help. Continue screaming into the warp. Keep getting more reinforcements. Again, the Tau have a decent navy, but they're not an impenetrable blockade. And they don't have the mass of navy to outright resist any Imperial force that comes against them, like some forces do, like Chaos often does. So, keep calling for help. Keep getting reinforcements in. And then, once you get that Umbrella and Scorpion system set up, go for a momentum reversal. Go for a general offensive. Now, it doesn't matter if it's successful. It really doesn't. If you can set up and organize a general offensive, you can start defeating the enemy both in depth and in minutia. If you can get individual units that are killing a couple of Tau at a time, you will eventually kill them out of having enough Tau to continue fighting. This accounts especially with the Auxiliaries, which are not going to be in as many numbers. So if you can kill enough of them, if you can get rid of enough suits, if you can cause enough of their counterpunches to be weakened or destroyed, you can flip the momentum, and you can quite easily roll them out and crush them. How to win? Get them on the defensive, control their movement, and their deployment options. If you might think, well, all of these very mobile units could help with weakening an offensive. If they're constantly having to redeploy to counter different enemy pushes, once the battle suits win here and they manage to defeat an enemy here, the Fire Warriors have fallen back here. They push the line back. That causes the battle suits to redeploy. They might be injured, they might be low on ammo, they still have to redeploy. They have to keep the defense up. Then you send in another group to fill in the area where they were just fighting. You just keep them hopping from one place to another. You keep them on the hop. You keep them not being able to resupply, not being able to repair their vehicles, continually losing stuff to attrition, and you will eventually collapse the force in on itself, and you will force them to dig into a defensive position. Once they dig in, you've kind of won. You've kind of won, because if they are on a defensive position, bombard them with artillery. It is time. You need to get out there, let the Earthshakers talk, set up at 15 kilometers, and just pound their positions. Because They're going to be building in the open. You're going to have defensive positions like cities, hives, all of that stuff. If you can surround them, control their movement and deployment options, if you can protect yourself orbitally, absolutely, just go ahead and artillery them to death. And hold that line. If they try and reset up the offensive, crush it. Crush it. Do not let them get an unanswered offensive. So never, like, set up a line and then just say, well, we'll take it back when they come and take it. The Tau are designed to continue their fight. They don't really care about taking territory. They just care about penetrating the defenses so that they can go in and weaken your overall defense. If they hit at you, have something ready to throw back, and keep that umbrella up and that scorpion waiting, so that when the Tau try and penetrate, their heavy assets will be held back because of the umbrella. Then when they get too far ahead, scorpion, punch them in the mouth, throw a counteroffensive at them, crush their lighter fire war units, and eventually they will be forced to retreat, or surrender, or be all dead. So, some lovely acknowledgements. Our next videos are, we have the archive video on Fields and Shields, in which I will be talking about a whole bunch of stuff, including some stuff in this video. Then the Knight Armory, so we'll be talking about weapons for Imperial Knights, and then Titan armies. Then after those three, and I will continue to be streaming as well, but just to give you guys the heads up, the cycle will begin. So the cycle is where we go. Each week, I will give you a couple options for videos. Or every time I finish a video, I'll give you a vote, and then when I'm ready to make the next video, I'll go off that vote. So I'll say, first one up is Armory, obviously, and then I will give you 4 options. Let's do Armory for this faction, this faction, this faction, and this faction. And we'll go through it like that. And then the next video, I'll say, okay, that was the Armory one. Now let's do Armies. And I'll give you 4 factions to choose from, or 4 forces to choose from. Then I'll do Adversaries. I'll give you 4 forces, and then 4 choices. And then I'll go to Archive, and then we will begin with Armory again. I may put in other videos in there, including streams. Some people were interested in, like, Corrupt Contenders. I might do streams on that. I am working on it again, getting a public version ready for you guys. And again, if you guys were interested in doing something like a Discord to set up and organize some stuff for the channel, maybe some information sharing, research, discussion of stuff, you know, before it gets in a video so I don't make a fool of myself, all that stuff is going to be great, but that's just going to be part of the cycle as we go on. I'm going to try and keep to 2 to 3 videos and or 2 to 3 streams a week. I am getting into a slightly busier season, so these everyday uploads are kind of my treat to you guys. That's not going to be the case forever. And while I will slow down, I will also be spending more time on the videos, making them longer, having better streams, having more material for you each time, and it will just get better and better from here. As we get more people, again, share around. It's great that I have all the Xenos done now, and we can move on to the big guns. So, couple of good memes here. Obvious Death Guard propaganda. They would never get so close to glorious Tau warriors. And then the great lie of the Guevesa having Tau wives. And I've put here, the cake is a lie, because the proverbial cake is indeed a lie. The Tau are creatures from a dry, arid plain world, like Chagoris, or Mundus Planus, depending on what type of White Scar you are. So yeah, just the cake is a lie, my friends. Do not fall for the Tau propaganda. They do not care for you. The greater good is not for you, my friend. And with that little piece of memery aside, I wish you all a lovely good night.